The Lord be with you. So for the third reading today, I want to read something that I just wrote 2 or 3 days ago. And it's a whimsical piece. And it'll feed into the theme of the homily. It's called Happy Birthday. You can put it to music later, Nancy. It's been a busy but highly rewarding week. I had to pick out a bunch of birthday cards, compose nice things to say, and pop them all in the post to arrive on the correct date. They did. And I was surprised at the lovely things they said about me. I blushed at the compliments and shocked at being busted for my many hidden talents. It felt really good. I'm amazed at the ego's energy and commitment to self-advertising and at its talent for disguising these vainglorious attempts. I am loyally served by self-promotion and self-deception, partners in crime, as they weave the tapestry of my self-image. I'm still in the kindergarten of the soul with the vocabulary that relies mainly on me and mine. My guardian angel smiles patiently at this infantile performance and prays that the ego will eventually grow up and be a simple servant of incarnation's real mission, unity consciousness. P.S. I'm hoping you didn't notice that this entire story was actually written by the ego in a pathetic attempt to show you the gift of which I am most proud, my humility. Words inspired by my ego. I'll warn to bet that if you, from your knowledge of history and of great world literature, had to make a list of the 10 most charismatic, inspiring public speakers of all time, I guarantee you Jesus would be right up near the top of that list. So it fascinates me just to kind of read what he said. This is a man obviously with an extraordinary intellect, obviously a deeply, deeply mystical kind of a character. Somebody who has the courage to speak his message fearlessly, to debate his interrogators, with an extraordinary ability to very, very simply and entertainingly propose the most esoteric of concepts in the simplest of language. He was a master of the paradox, and he was brilliant at suddenly twisting the end of a story and making it finish up in a way you never would have predicted from the first 90% of it. I'll just give you an example to illustrate that last piece. There's a story in Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, which is called the parable of the unjust steward. And very simply, it's a story, Jesus is talking as normally about the kingdom of heaven, the various aspects of it. And he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a rich man who had a steward who was in charge of all his property. And at some stage, he found out that this steward was embezzling his property. So he calls him into the office and says, I hear that you've been embezzling my property, so I want an accounting because I'm going to fire you. You're going to be out. And so this guy goes out and thinks, wow, what am I going to do now? I'm too old to dig. I could never be a farmer at this stage of my life. How am I going to earn a living? I'm not going to go out begging. I have a reputation to hold up. People see me as an important guy. I can't just go and beg. I got it. I know what I'm going to do. So he calls in all his master's debtors one by one. He says, Ron, how much do you owe my master? And Ron says, 100 bushels of wheat. So I said, okay, there you go. There's your bill. Change the 100 to 50. Notice he's not doing it himself. He's not changing it himself. It's going to be Ron's writing on this bill, finally. So he changes it to 50. Then he says, Karen, how much do you owe my master? I owe him 100 jars of oil. Okay, here's your bill. Change it to 80. So she changes it to 80. And he goes around to all of the debtors and he changes their bill. And so he gets fired. And now he goes around and says, dude, right, bakshishi here, Ron. So he's creaming it off. So I'm sure he's now stashing this in the Cayman Islands or a Swiss bank account or someplace. And so the master finds this out, obviously. Now you'd expect that Jesus would end the story by saying, and now the master got really, really upset. Not only is he going to fire the guy, He's going to bring him to court, and the guy's going to spend 30 years in jail. You expect that. How did Jesus end the story? He said, the master praised the unjust steward. He commended him. Because the children of this world are more cunning and wiser with their kind than are the children of light. Now, what in God's name did he mean? He twisted the story totally, orthogonally from where you would expect that it would go. So what's he saying? What he's saying is, here is somebody, the unjust steward, who could translate every single life situation to his own economic advantage. When he was working for this guy, he was embezzling and he was creaming it off. But even when he got fired, he was able to turn that situation to his own economic advantage. So what's Christ saying? Christ is saying, what about the children of light? Every single situation in your life, he's telling us, every person, every relationship, every event in your life, you must be able to harvest it for love and compassion and forgiveness and growth, spiritual growth. There is nobody in your life, there is no situation in which you find yourself, there's never been any event in your life from which you can't harvest love. So Christ is saying, look at this guy, learn from him. There was no situation that he couldn't turn to his own economic advantage. If your eyes are open, there is no situation in your life, he's telling us. There's no event in your life, there's no relationship in your life which you can't harvest for spiritual ends. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to make basically 3 main points. So firstly, I'm going to do a quick review, a life review of 72 years for myself. And then secondly, I'm going to look at the major traumas and the major blessings. And then thirdly, I'm going to look at the terms of the contract. So the first one, a quick review of 72 years. So for me, strangely enough, turning 72 is more significant than turning 70 was 2 years ago, and the great party that Ria organised for me at that stage. Because all the people, good, thank you. Because 72 is a great number mathematically. It has 10 factors. You can divide it by 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, 12, 18, 24, and 36. It's very, very versatile. And in binary number, it's beautiful. It's 100, 1000. So it's a lovely number. So I'm really happy to be turning 72 today. But much more importantly, as I was preparing for the men's retreat a few weeks ago, I began thinking, what does it mean for me to turn 72? And I remembered, this great statement attributed to Joseph Campbell, follow your bliss. But Joseph Campbell, he was borrowing an idea that had been there for 2,000 years before him. An old Latin adage that said, carpe diem, seize the day. So that's basically what follow your bliss is about. And I began to think as I was preparing myself for the men's retreat, I look back over my life, the 72 years, and I'm thinking, what were the major, transformational experiences that were made by others for me, and what were the ones that I made for myself? Because there was a huge difference. There are major transformations that are made by others for you, and then there are major transformations you made yourself. When others make major transformations, decisions for us, in some senses, we are victims of life. When we make them for ourselves, we are masters of our own life. And so I want to kind of just focus on that. As I review for myself the 72 years, I'm going to look at what were the major decisions that were made by others for me, and what were the major decisions that I made for myself. And just very, very quickly, 2 examples. Major transformative experiences made for others, by others for me, over which I had no say-so or control, was being given away at age 6 months to my grandparents to raise me. And at age 6 years being given back to my parents, whom I didn't know at that stage. 2 huge decisions made without ever me being consulted. On the other hand, I look at major decisions I made for myself, like deciding I wanted to be a priest, like deciding I wanted to live in Africa, like deciding I wanted to be a psychologist, like deciding to move to the United States of America. So these are 2 different groups of decisions, huge decisions, some disempowering and some really empowering. So if I were to kind of walk through it just chronologically for a few moments, I'm going to focus completely on, I'm not so much interested in professional stuff or, sociological factors as I am on what happens to my cosmology and what happens to my spirituality as I walk the steps through these 72 years. So I'm thinking, for instance, of my childhood, and most of you can identify with this. growing up in a Catholic family where, the belief system was extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there is no salvation. So Protestants, tough luck. Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, they're all out. Because we have an infallible leader in Rome called the Pope, and he leads us to the truth. So I'm totally convinced, as a small child, that this was it. And then I remember very significantly the day that Pius XII died. It was 1958. And I was listening to a radio reporter, and he said something about Pius was one of the good popes. And I turned to my grandmother, I'm living with my grandmother, and I used to call her Big Mammy. Big Mammy? What did he mean? He was one of the good popes. Were there bad popes? And Big Mammy says, which child? There's no such thing as a bad pope. I don't know whether she believed it or not at that stage, but certainly that's what she told me. And so I'm totally convinced, this guy on the radio was talking mishigas, total ridiculous kind of stuff. There couldn't be a bad pope. In fact, I was convinced as a little child that if only every country in the world could elect a Catholic bishop as president, there'd be immediate peace all over the world. I was totally convinced that was the solution to all world problems, hunger and warfare. Just to elect a Catholic bishop to be the president. What's so big a deal? Why can't they figure that out? So at age 18, I go to the seminary. At age 16, Vatican II begins to happen. 1962, 62 to 65, you have Vatican II. And all of a sudden, my theology is turned upside down. Now I'm hearing that, I won't go to hell if I eat sausages on a Friday. And I find out that, the infidels, the perfidious Jews, and the Saracens, the Muslims, and the Protestants, and Hindus and Buddhists, they're our separated brethren. They're not the damned anymore, they're our brethren. They're just separated. They don't have the full truth. They got some of it, not all of it. We got all of it still, we got all of it. But it's not as bad. It wasn't as black and white. I'm like, well, okay, that's interesting. So I begin shifting my cosmology a little bit. Stop laughing, Johnny Hannibal. This is serious stuff. Then I go to the seminary at age 18. And the seminary as well, I'm going to University College Cork. So I'm majoring in pure mathematics and mathematical physics. And so I'm seeing now this kind of the disunity between theology and science, where when I go into the church on a Sunday, I have to put my finger in the holy water font, and make the sign of the cross and park my brain at the door. When I go into the college, I have to park my soul at the door. And I'm like, how can we manage to kind of put these two pieces together? Why are they contradicting each other? And the seminary, I began to study theology, and I began to study church history. And boy, was that an eye-opener. You go back to the Middle Ages, to the Medicis and the Borgias, who owned the Catholic Church for over 200 years. And you look at how many popes were assassinated by the popes who succeeded them to the papacy. Again and again and again. And I'm beginning, wow, what's something wrong with this picture? And then I'm thinking, but that was a long time ago. That was in the 1500s. That kind of crap doesn't happen anymore. We're the good guys at this stage. And I always remember the rector of the seminary, a theologian, a trained theologian. At that stage, some parts of the Mass were now in English, in the vernacular, but the words of consecration were still in Latin. And the rector was a little guy called Jimmy Lane. He had a very strange accent, and he terrified us. But he was a trained theologian. So I remember saying one day, they're changing the Mass. No, some parts of it we can say in English, but they're never going to change the words of our Lord, the words of consecration, hoc est enim corpus meum. They'll never be changed because they're the words of Jesus. I'm thinking, holy God Almighty, this guy is a trained theologian. Does he really believe that at the Last Supper, when Jesus was celebrating the Passover, that he was using Latin? And of course, within 2 or 3 years, we're using it. It's English now. We're using it in English. So that was the kind of the mindset as you went through the seminary. At age 26, I'm kind of unleashed on Africa. November 1972. And I'm going there because I'm still convinced that, I have the truth as a Catholic priest, and I'm going to kind of educate these ignorant savages who are living in the darkness of Africa. Only to find out, literally within weeks of getting there, that these people had a much deeper kind of spirituality than I had, because it wasn't confined to Sunday Mass. For these people, it was a kind of animism or pantheism where God was present in everything. And I began to realize, oh my God, this isn't what I was expecting. I didn't come here now to convert them. I began to realize there's a difference between being a missionary and being a crusader. A crusader is somebody who comes into another culture with an idea of what's true and imposes it on the second culture. A missionary is somebody who cross-fertilizes two cultures for their mutual benefit. What Carl Jung one time called a Gnostic intermediary. Somebody who's so off there with two different cultures or two different languages that you don't go in order to kind of impose a colonial viewpoint on the education system, on the medical system, on the agricultural system, or the religious system, but to cross-fertilize to the mutual benefit of both parties. That's what it was about. And so in the long, equatorial nights, I lived right on the equator, literally on the equator. I crossed the equator several times a day. So there was 12-hour days, 12-hour nights. Now, there was no way I could go to bed at 6 o'clock at night just because the sun happened to go down. If you went to bed and stayed in bed, as long as the sun was down in Ireland, you'd be in bed about 18 hours a day during the winter. And so there's no way I could go to bed at 6 o'clock at night. And so I have candles burning, and I'm thinking and reading and writing. I wrote my first book with 3 candles sitting in front of me, wrote it in Swahili. And I'm trying to think through these issues. And I began to examine all of the belief systems that I'd been brought up in and ask myself this question. If I'd been born a Hindu and somebody proposed this particular belief system to me, would I think it makes sense, or would I say this was crazy? If I thought it was crazy, I'd throw it out. If I could say, yeah, even if I were born Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, and somebody said this teaching, I would say, yeah, that makes sense. Then I would hold on to that. So I'm trying to make 2 groups, one to be kind of go through the shredder and the other to keep on. So a lot of my time in Africa was spent just totally revisiting my own cosmology and my own spirituality. Then at age 40, I came to the States and joined the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And for the first time in my life, I'm actually rubbing shoulders with Buddhists and Hindus and Jews and Sufis and Muslims, real people. It's one thing to read about these systems. It's something very different to actually be friends with people like this. You learn a lot more from relationships than you do from books. And begin to realize, the extraordinary wisdom of these different kinds of traditions. And I began to radically revise my own thinking again because of this situation. I was at this stage, I'm working with the Catholic Diocese of San Jose, living in St. Albert's, where I met Margie and Manny for the first time. So I'm doing circuit rider. There were 5 Catholic churches, 5 parishes had been amalgamated in 1986-87. So on a Sunday, I do circuit rider. I'd say Mass at 2 or 3 of these places for about 8 years. But more and more, I am having issues with Catholic theology and Catholic moral positions. I begin to see that Catholicism, and in fact Christianity in general, has a fixation on sexuality, a total fixation. And when you fixate on something and you repress it, it leaks out at the edges. And we're seeing this in spades in the pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church. If you repress anything, it's going to leak out at the edges. And so I began to question Catholic teaching on, sex before marriage, homosexuality, birth control, abortion under all circumstances, even if a little 9-year-old girl were insisted by an uncle, became pregnant, that she's meant to carry a baby. So I began to look at all of these facts. Some of these positions, I can't, there's no way I can hold on to these anymore. I began to look more deeply at the question of patriarchy and hierarchy and the extraordinary way women are abused in the Catholic system. That a woman, just because of gender, could never be a priest. It didn't make any sense to me that this would be so. Particularly when I look at the 2 strongest leaders of the early church were Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary of Magdala, his companion. And somehow all of this gets suppressed. And we have instead a patriarchal, hierarchical system where basically the laity are meant, on a Sunday to show up, pay up, and shut up. That was basically the function of the laity. And so there's total suppression. And I began to look at this notion of infallibility even more deeply. And now I go back and I really study church history, and I come across guys like Formosus I, a pope who was pope between 891 and 896. Before he was offed. And after he died, he was being accused of being a heretic. Now, if the popes are infallible, how could a guy be a heretic? So the guy who succeeded him disinterred the body, I kid you not, dressed him up in full pontificals, sat him on the throne of Peter with a deacon standing behind him to answer the questions, and they interrogated him. I'm dead serious. And they found him guilty of heresy, and they cut off the 2 fingers that he used for the papal blessing. They cut off the 2 fingers, and they threw him into the Tiber. And he got caught in some fishermen's nets. Talk about being fishers of men. And his disciples, who were still alive, hauled him ashore, and they buried him. And a few months later, this was discovered. They disinterred the body for the second time. You can imagine the state was in at this stage. And they sat him again on the throne of Peter. I don't know, he probably had no face even at this stage, but he's wearing a mitre. And they interrogate him for the second time, with the deacon standing behind him to answer the questions. And they find him guilty again. And they cut off the 3 remaining fingers on his right hand, and they throw him into the Tiber for the second time. And maybe because he was, in the shoes of Peter, thou art Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, he got caught in nets again. And the disciples pulled him ashore, and he's now still buried in the Vatican. And I began to think, this was an infallible pope who got accused of heresy on 2 different occasions and had his fingers cut off. Do I really believe that we only discovered in 1870 that the pope was infallible? So was it retroactive, or it just began with Pius IX? So these kind of things made less and less sense to me. And then I got really fascinated with the notion of reincarnation for several reasons. I mean, the funny thing is, I lived with peoples in East Africa, the Kalenjin peoples, who believed in a form of reincarnation, but I didn't pay much attention to it. It felt like it was just kind of a mythology. So, for instance, when a baby was born in the Kalenjin peoples, a few days after it was born, they would call in one of the elders of the tribe who knew the ancestry of this baby. And the elder would name off the names of the ancestors. And when the baby sneezed, they say, that's the guy, he's back. So it was given a special name. So it was a reincarnated ancestor. I thought this was interesting kind of mythology, but I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And then I came here, and over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, through self-hypnosis and through regression therapy and through meditation, I had memories of 11 different incarnations of my own. And that totally changed the equation for me. There's nothing like an experience to change a bias against a theoretical position. And so I began talking about this kind of stuff in St. Albert's and St. Aloysius and St. Anne's, being really careful to say, here's what the Hindus say about this, or here's what the Buddhists believe about this. But eventually I kind of got outed, and I began to discover he really likes this kind of stuff. So in some senses, that's how my theology or my cosmology changed over those 72 years. That's my first point. The second point I want to make is I'm going to call it major traumas and major blessings. So if I were to look at kind of the major traumatic events, just a few of them in the course of 72 years, the first one, as I mentioned, would have been at age 6 months, where I'm given away by my parents to my grandparents. And the backstory was, my parents were both 19, when they got married. My father was the eldest of his family. There was a big, big family, 9 kids. And my grandmother and my mother were both pregnant at the same time. And I won the race by 2 months. So I was born in October of 1946, and my youngest uncle, Noel, was born in December of 1946. And so my grandmother pleaded with mother, please let him come and live here, because Noel has nobody. There was a big gap between Noel and Teresa, who was ahead of him. And so I was given away to my grandparents at age 6 months. Now, I obviously had no memory about that, and if it was traumatic, it was unconscious trauma, but obviously it does something to be taken away from your mother and given to somebody else. The second one then was 6 years later. This was my new family, and Noel was my brother, and now I'm taken out and brought back to my family of origin to discover I have 3 siblings that I had never interacted with. Seamus, whom you all very well know, and Deirdre, my sister, and Ethna, my other sister. And so over that, I was really devastated. I was old enough at that stage to be really, really devastated by that, and for 2 or 3 years afterwards. So that was a huge kind of a traumatic event. I'm going to skip way forward to 1986, where after living for 14 years in Kenya and really loving Kenya, of being forced out by the government because of positions I was taking on social justice issues. After I attended a big rally in which the president of the country, Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, was speaking, and I confronted him about the stuff that was going on in my own area, where people were being forced to contribute to collections that he was making. There were supposed to be harambe, self-help donations, but they were being forced with whips to contribute goats or whatever. And I was constantly butting heads with the local politicians. And then I had this encounter with him, and I was given 48 hours to leave. So I leave Kenya in the 20th of May 1986 and spend the loneliest year of my life the next year in London, although I utilized it to study hypnosis and Jungian psychology. But I was really, really devastated. I really, really, really missed Kenya. So that was huge for me. Then I came to the States, and then in 1995, after working for 8 years in the Diocese of San Jose, particularly in St. Albert's, receiving a letter from the bishop telling me he wanted me out of his diocese within 3 months. And the backstory to that was, when I was working in St. Albert's, I love public speaking. And so I got invitations to give lectures and stuff in other parishes. So I was invited to give a series of lectures by the parish of Mountain View, on the family. And I chose 6 different topics, one each week, kind of representing the family issues. And I devoted one lecture to family and sexuality. And I had the temerity to use the word vagina and penis from the altar, for which I was never forgiven. So some years later, the guy who was pastor in Mountain View got moved to Palo Alto as the pastor, and he was hell-bent, he wanted me out, and he succeeded. So I had a meeting with the bishop, and the bishop said, I don't want to lose somebody of your pastoral ability to the diocese. Let's see if we can figure something out. So obviously they got to him, and I was barely back from that meeting. 2 or 3 days, I got a letter saying, I want you out of my diocese within 3 months. And so I was kicked out of the diocese in 1985. And then on the Feast of St. Francis, 2010, 4 days before my 64th birthday, I got a 2-page letter in Latin from the Vatican telling me they no longer required my services. They had copied it to the church where I was baptized 64 years before to strike my name off the baptism register as a Catholic priest. They told me I could never represent myself again as a Catholic theologian. I could never teach in a Catholic grade school, high school, university. And I was dispensed from my vow of celibacy. And the only kind of privilege left to me was that if I came across somebody who was dying and there was no other priest there to hear his confession, I could hear his confession. So I'm still waiting for that to happen. So I can say, I'm back. So the thing was, that was the 4th of October 2010. 5 weeks later, my mother died. Now, she'd been sick for quite a while. So I spent the last 72 hours round the clock with her. And her funeral mass was she died on the 17th of November 2010. Her funeral mass was arranged for the Saturday, which was November the 20th. Now, I'm thinking, I show up for the mass, and I'm wondering, when I vest in the sacristy, is the pastor going to say, dude, you're no longer one of us. You can't celebrate this mass. So until I actually arrived at the altar, I had no guarantee I'd be allowed to say mass in the church. In actual fact, 6 of my brother priests celebrated with me. And that was the last time I've ever said mass in a Catholic church. It was the same church I had said my first mass in on the 5th of June in 1972, 10,047 days before. So my first mass and my last mass were in that church, and haven't been allowed to say mass in a Catholic church ever since. So they were the traumas. What were the blessings? Because when I began to harvest all of these things, there was extraordinary blessings contained. Every single one of them contained extraordinary blessings. I go back to age 6 months, and I'm given away to my grandparents. The result was I got to grow up with one of the most extraordinary human beings I know. My uncle Noel. He and I were like twins, born 2 months apart, different father, different mother, but we're like twins. So I never had the opportunity of bonding that closely with a really mystical, beautiful soul. No, we're still really, really, really close. So whatever it took to get us together for that period of time, that's what happened. And I've certainly learned to harvest that 6-year period for all the blessings inherent in it. At age 6 years, I'm given back to my parents, and that was really, really dramatic and traumatic for me. The blessing was this, that my grandparents were very, very poor, and so none of their kids went to high school, including my father. My father was the eldest in the family. He was sent out to work at age 13, even though he had a scholarship, a very bright guy. He had a scholarship to attend high school free. They couldn't afford to not have him working. So all of my aunts and uncles, none of them went to high school. In fact, the vast bulk of them had to emigrate to England to get work. Now, if I hadn't been yanked out of that family, I probably would never have gone to high school and maybe have wound up emigrating as well. But my father and my mother were both very well interested in education. In fact, my father, in his 40s, having never finished grade school, he went back and he attended high school. He finished high school, he went to college and he did a master's degree in archaeology, and he spent the last 20 years of his life working as an archaeologist. My mother had finished high school, but in her 60s and 70s, she went back to college 3 different times for 3 different degrees. She never used any of them. She did it just for the fun of learning. She did a degree in catechetics, she did a degree in economics, and she did a degree in computer science, none of which she ever used, but just for the sheer fun of learning. So the great blessing was I then grew up in a family where education was really, really prized and got to have a good education in the process. So that was the great blessing, just being brought back to that family. In Kenya, getting thrown out of Kenya, 1986 at age 40, I would never have come to the States otherwise. I would never have become a psychologist, which I loved. It's a very privileged way of helping people in distressful kinds of situations. So I would never have had that opportunity through that. So in some senses, getting kicked out of Kenya, mourning it for a year, it was an extraordinary blessing in disguise. In 1995, getting kicked out of the Diocese of San Jose. At that stage, I was kind of getting used to getting kicked out of places. So there would never have been a COJ if that hadn't happened. There were the seeds of COJ. That's what allowed us to form this community, a totally different kind of spiritual community where there are no bosses, there's nobody in charge. Anybody who has an idea is encouraged to develop the idea. We use the 3 principles that I used in Kenya: kujitegemea, self-reliance; kujitumikia, self-ministering; and kujieneza, self-propagating, in the sense that if you're doing something good as a community, people will be attracted to it. And we've built this community over the last 21 years because of that. I wouldn't have been involved in this community. Maybe the community wouldn't have existed, I don't know. Maybe somebody else would have done it. But if I hadn't been kicked out of the diocese, that would never have happened. And this is one of the chief blessings of my life, being a member of this community. And then finally, in 2010, the letter from the Vatican, it felt to me as if the final handcuff had been chopped. And I was now totally free to think and to speak in any way I wanted. So I began to realize, the extraordinary blessings that these apparent traumas, in some senses, they're built into the contract. If you don't make the kinds of changes yourself, God is going to make the changes for you. And as I look back at that, and I ask myself the question, if I could do it again, what would I have done differently? Obviously, I made mistakes. So I would have said that particularly in the way I confronted people when I had different viewpoints on stuff, theological differences or whatever, I hope I would, from this vantage point, if I could redo it, there would be less ego and more soul in the confrontation. There would be less anger and more compassion in it. There would have been maybe less reactivity and more proactive on my part. And certainly there would have been less of getting kicked out of places and more of walking out of places, taking the decision myself rather than having it foisted upon me. So when I look back at it, I see that every single one of these was an extraordinary blessing for which I am deeply grateful. That's my second point. So the third point I call terms of the contract. So I believe that every single one of us comes down here because we volunteered to incarnate. And we come down here, but we're not alone. We're surrounded by, a host of mentor figures, both incarnated mentor figures and disincarnate mentor figures, angelic beings, past family members, that they're guiding us and loving us through the entire process. And they're the ones that help us to see the hidden meaning in situations. Very, very often, the deepest meaning is not the obvious meaning in a situation or in a relationship, or in a life event. The deepest meanings are the hidden ones. The most important meanings are the ones you have to search for. So I've come to the conclusion that it's not so important where you look as how you look. If you don't know how to look, you can look everywhere and find nothing. If you do know how to look, it really doesn't matter where you look, you'll find everything. And so in some senses, God continues to send her extraordinary intelligence to form, all of the situations and to inform all of the situations in which we find ourselves, because there are blessings, there's a harvest to be reaped in every single one of those. And we do it as a cohort group, what I've called a preconception contract, that we migrate from incarnation to incarnation as groups of souls that have been together many times in the past. We've changed genders, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, IQ level, religious affiliation. We've changed all these unimportant parameters, but it's the same group of souls walking with each other, creating the kinds of dramas in which everybody gets the ideal circumstances to develop what they've come to develop here. So again and again and again, we meet people and circumstances that we're destined to meet. So it changes for me the whole meaning of karma and fate and destiny. Karma for me is not a punitive mechanism whereby I'm being punished in subsequent parts of my life or in subsequent incarnations for mistakes I made in previous parts of my life or previous incarnations. That is not what karma is. Karma is the realization that before we come down, we plan our hand. We know who we're coming in with. We know the trajectory. We know the history of each of the souls that we're coming in with. We know our own history as a soul, and we know what our mission is. Karma means that you wake up to the realization that the hand I was dealt in this life was the hand that I planned before I started this life. And then fate is not some kind of an inevitable outcome. Fate is how I play my hand. I can play it well or badly. I can use my free will to totally, drag a coach and four through my mission and not do it. And then destiny is not predetermined either. It's not a punitive mechanism. Destiny is the final result. When I finally do my life review with the mentors after I've shuffled off this mortal coil, the destiny is, okay, here's what you set out to do. Here's how you played your card. What do you want to do now next time? What changes do you need to make? So the destiny is reworking so that the next hand I come in with, takes cognizance of all of the previous hands I had and the ways in which I played them. So that's part of the contract. We get a whole bunch of tools when we come in. One of them is we got this extraordinarily elegant GPS system. Probably one of the most important gifts anybody ever gave me years and years and years ago, because I got this extraordinary posho for getting lost. I was living in Palo Alto for 15 years and I was still getting lost between ITP and whatever place I was living at the time. With the GPS system, it's like God in a sense, it always knows where you are. You don't have to say to him, I'm at the intersection of, Willow and Middlefield. I don't have to say that. It knows exactly where I am. God knows exactly where I am spiritually. I plug in my destination, and then God presumes that even if I take a wrong turn, I didn't hear the command or I decide to override it, it still presumes I want to go to the destination I plugged in. So it'll keep making adjustments to the directions to make sure you get to where you said you wanted to go. That's what God does for us. There's the inner voice that guides us. No matter how often we ignore it or mishear it, God still presumes what you have in mind is enlightenment. So you want to be enlightened, I'll tell you how to get there. Here's the next step you need to make. Because no matter where you are, you can only get to your destination by starting where you are. I told you this funny story about being lost in Limerick City years and years and years ago. Totally lost. I'm looking for a place called Washington Street. And I roll down the window of my car, and there's a guy passing by, and I say, excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Washington Street? And he's wearing a cap, and he takes off his cap, and he scratches his head a few times and says, tell you the truth now, if I was going to Washington Street, I wouldn't start from here at all. It's so difficult to get you to Washington Street from here. I wish we met someplace else. And I said, dude, this is where we're meeting. Yeah, me too. I wish we met someplace else, but this is where we're meeting. And so, in a sense, you can only get to where you want, which is enlightenment, by starting where you are. No matter what your life trajectory has been, no matter what your circumstances right now are, you can only get there by starting here. So that's one of the great tools we have, this GPS system. I woke up a few mornings ago with this brilliant notion. Do you know Google Earth? You used to hear Google Earth, where you can literally, it's an application on your computer where you can plug in an address. So I could plug in 4180 Shane Way, Healdsburg, and all of a sudden the globe spins and it zeroes down, greater and greater magnification, and I see my own house. Or I say, I want to see Kipsarman village in Baringo district of the Rift Valley in Kenya. And the globe begins to spin wildly again, and it zeroes down, and all of a sudden, I'm looking at one of the churches I built in Kipsarman. And so this extraordinary thing, I begin to think, that's what reincarnation is like. We spin the globe. Now we put in an address. This time, I want to be such and such. And we spin the globe. We want a particular body, we want a particular family, we want a particular culture, we want a particular era, and we spin the globe, and we zoom down into it, and all of a sudden, there you are. But you can revisit any of the other time, any of the other places that you've lived. So we have all these tools that are built into it. We have the tool of, you could compare it to like a jigsaw puzzle. When you buy a jigsaw puzzle and you tumble all the pieces onto the table, the first thing you have to do is make an act of faith and trust that all of the pieces you need are contained in the box, and all the pieces in the box are necessary to complete the puzzle. You're not going to wind up, with 3 or 4 holes, or 15 extra pieces. Everything that's there is necessary, and everything that's necessary is there. There is nothing in your life, and there's nothing that's ever happened in your life which was not a necessary part of your journey. And there's no extra pieces. There are no relationships or event that you can discard and say they're unimportant. There are no unimportant pieces in the jigsaw puzzle of your life. Another image I like to use sometimes is, you've all played 20 questions, that 20 questions, where I say to Marge, think of something and then don't tell me what it is, and then give me 20 questions, and I'll ask you 20 questions, and I have to figure out at the end what you had in mind. So that's the normal way we play 20 questions. And if I'm really good at it, I can zero in, I can figure out finally what Margie has in her mind. There's another version of it which was created by a very famous American physicist, John Wheeler. It's a different version of 20 questions. So I said to Margaret, think of something, and I'm going to try and figure out what it is you're thinking of. And Margaret decides, to play it tough. So she decides not to think of anything. She's going to pretend she has, but she's actually not thinking of anything. And I've got to ask 20 questions. If I'm really good at it, I can actually force Margaret to pick something. If she gives me consistent, truthful answers to all the questions I have, I can literally zero in, and Margaret finally has no choice but to isolate the particular. There's only one thing that will answer yes to all the questions I've asked her. I don't know what it is before we started, and she didn't know what it was, but we figured out between us. We zero in on it. Now, in some senses, that's really how we want to live our lives. We don't want other people having ideas that they want us to guess. God does not have an idea that she wants us to guess about life. God has no idea. All God wants is for each of us to be an enlightened being. And as far as the route is concerned, or the time is concerned, God could care less. But by asking questions of life, you can force God to reveal what the final outcome is. So there are tools in the bag. And so as you look at your life, any of us, who hasn't undergone some significant major transformations in our psychology, in our cosmology, in our spirituality, we're asleep at the wheel. If I still have the same mindset, at age 72 that I had at age 12 when I heard about bad popes, I obviously haven't grown. It's incumbent upon every single one of us to radically shift our cosmologies and our spiritualities at least 3 or 4 times in the course of a lifetime. I love the 2 last joyful mysteries of the Rosary in the Catholic tradition. The fourth joyful mystery is called the Presentation in the Temple, where the 8-day-old baby Jesus is presented. He's made part of the Jewish faith and the Hebrew culture. Very important. Every single one of us needs to be inducted into and brought up in some kind of a wisdom tradition or a spiritual tradition. But at age 12, the final one, the finding in the temple, he's apparently lost in the temple. And he's debating with the scholars of the time. Because as a 12-year-old boy, Jesus had figured out there's more to spirituality than this Jewish thinking. It's not that I reject my Judaism, but there must be other great wisdom traditions out there, and he set out in pursuit of those. Every one of us was presented in the temple by our parents, and we were indoctrinated into a culture and into a spirituality. Great. It was vitally important. But if at age 12, or age 24, or 36, or 48, or 72, I'm still in the temple in which I was baptized as a kid, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. We have to continue to grow. There's a great story in the Hebrew tradition from the Midrash kind of the folklore that grows up around, parsing the Bible, about Adam and Eve after they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And they were thrown out because they ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they're banned forever from coming back in. But this Hebrew myth says that they actually snuck back in one night, in the middle of the night, and they come up to the tree, and they're just about to pluck one of the fruits to eat it, and they hear rustling in the leaves. And they look, and there's God himself munching on an apple. Busted. Because even God needs to change our cosmology. God needs to grow. The immanent God needs to grow. The God as is revealed through nature. So we finish with this then. Every single one of us, we came here because we enthusiastically volunteered to be here. And you chose your parents, you chose your family, you chose your culture, you chose your time, you chose your religion, you chose the era of human history. You came in here enthusiastically because you wanted to shift the entire thing into a Christ consciousness. You didn't land here by bad luck. You are not going through critical times right now because you weren't prepared for it. The crisis in the Catholic Church now at the moment, and the crisis in our country right now, and the crisis in our world right now, you were fully aware that you were coming to a time when these needed to be negotiated. The question is, how do you respond to them? Are you responding with anger, or anxiety, or fear, or xenophobia? Are you responding with love and with courage? Because one of the greatest tools we've been given is the tool of creativity. When Apollo 13 got into trouble, and it looked like they were going to all die, nobody could get up there and bring equipment that they needed. They had to figure it out for what was on board. God is not going to parachute down here and save us from our situations. God says, you have all the resources, all you need is the creativity to respond to the problems. We have everything we need to save our spacecraft, planet Earth. The only question is, have we the creativity to do it? The most creative force on planet Earth is love. And it's a tool that has many different kinds of, ways of being calibrated. 3 different kinds of settings you can take. And the 3 most important settings on this tool of love are laughter, the ability to laugh at the illusion of what we think is the truth. Secondly, forgiveness, the ability to realize, as the French say, to understand everything is to forgive everything. Not that you kind of condone what's happening, but that you can contextualize what's happening and respond to it. And the last one then is to be compassionate towards everybody, beginning with yourself. So I'd end with 4 questions I'd throw out for you as I wrestle with them myself. And the questions would be these. As you look back in your life journey, are there things you would have done differently? But much more importantly, as you look into the future, are there things you want to do differently? And the last 2 questions, can you differentiate in yourself, the great decisions, the transformative decisions that were made by others for you, and the great decisions that you made for yourself?